I'm Isabella and you're listening to Zeno. Each month I have conversations with people from all walks of life about their personal stories of home, identity and the search for belonging. Sui SearleOur, welcome to the show. It's so wonderful to have you here and I'm incredibly excited to be talking about your newsletter and Substack Radicle, as well as your platform Decolonize the Garden. Grateful to have you here in the studio, and I'd love to start by asking you, how do you describe yourself and what you do?
Oh my gosh, I describe myself as a gardener, a printmaker, a reluctant speaker, and a writer. I really hate describing myself. I always feel like I'm narrowing myself down and putting myself into like a neat little box, but I guess those are the things I most likely tell people.
I think what is calling out at the moment to discuss is firstly your platform Decolonize the Garden. And I'd love to hear a bit more about what was your motivation for starting the platform.
So it started in 2020 and it was during COVID when the Black Lives Matter movement really came into mass consciousness. Obviously, it had been going on some time before, but the murder of George Floyd and then all the conversations that sprung up around that. And it prompted me to start it because in the horticultural industry, there was just such a silence around all of those issues and a lack of engagement and understanding. And because I had been engaging in those kind of conversations for the previous 2 to 3 years, I just felt equipped to have some of those conversations and or at least to initiate them, ask questions and to get people to start thinking. So I guess it was born slightly out of frustration and feeling like there was something to be done there was something to contribute. Yeah, but it all feels like a long time ago now. I can't believe 4 years have passed since then.
It seems like the platform that you launched has become such a clarion call for all of these intersecting issues. And I wonder, how did Radicle as a newsletter come out of Decolonize the Garden?
It came out of it because I felt like there needed to be more thoughtful, slower, longer form writing that just, places like Instagram just don't lend themselves to that. And also to diversify the people who are contributing. So it was open to anyone who wanted to write. And I particularly wanted to platform stories and voices that tend to be marginalised or, aren't given a platform to be heard. And I just felt like I wanted to do something with the platform and visibility that I'd been given. It just felt like an avenue that felt right to me. Like, I like writing and I like longer form.
And what was important for you in that process of creating a space for other voices to be heard?
Yeah, I just want people to be able to be authentic and to not feel like they have to wear any masks or that they're being policed, and to feel like a freedom to speak the stories and say the things that they want to say in a way that's related to growing or horticulture or the land, all of those issues. So it was all quite open, really. And I also wanted it to be led by what people wanted to say, which naturally means that hopefully they would come. I would make this as an offering and a platform, and then if people wanted to speak, they can.
It's absolutely beautiful, and obviously we'll share links to the platforms in the show notes, and really encourage everybody to read your articles on the newsletter and also on Instagram as well, Decolonize the Garden. It's such a beautiful metaphor that you've highlighted through Radicle, in terms of what the significance of Radicle is in the gardening sense. And I'll just read out what you've had on the newsletter. So you write, Radicle as a noun is the embryonic root inside the seed. The primary root, radicle, is the first part of a seedling to emerge from the seed during the process of germination. It grows downward into the soil, anchoring the seedling and allowing it to take up water and send out its leaves so that it can begin to photosynthesize. And that metaphor really touched me because it's something that's so tender, and that it's almost like it's the very beginnings of what hopefully a better world that we can shape together. It's so funny because when I think of that word, I'm really lucky to be part of an amazing group of women. We have an embodied writing group. We focus on nature writing, but from an embodied lens. And one of the prompts that we worked through together is we physically reenacted what it would be like to be a seed and to grow for the first time. And so like when I read that and think about the word radical, I'm like going back to when I was like in a seed-like shape on the floor, putting my little hand out of my body, and it just, and something so hopeful about that act, like the act of literally just the very first root coming out. And yeah, I'd just love to learn more about, you know, what was the motivation around that for you?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I guess it's also a play on the word radical, right? To be radical, to grasp something by the root. But I really liked this spelling and meaning of it, because no one has all the answers, and radical is not pretending to have any of them. They are just ideas and probing and a scattering of seed to see what germinates. And yeah, it's like a collective effort for us to grow and nurture the future that we want to see, the better future we want to see. So yeah, that's why it spoke to me. And I still like that it sounds like the other word radical, because I don't know, I like that kind of challenge for people, and to make people stop and think, and yeah, for people to notice that actually this isn't spelled quite the same. What does it mean?
Well, it feels very profound. And yeah, as you say with the play on words for radical, it's planting the seed for a more expansive collective way of being, right?
Yeah. I mean, I know that challenge can perhaps sometimes put people off too, but I do like that edge to it. I like pushing the edges and being at the edge. And I think if you don't do that, it's just easy to ignore the message or to be too comfortable. And breaking out of a seed case and that kind of visceral transformation, it probably is slightly uncomfortable. It's not necessarily going to be all pleasant and nice, just as birth isn't for people. So yeah, I like finding where those edges are.
Beautiful. And we'll definitely touch on edges as well at a later point. I'd love to ask, how did you find yourself in the gardening space? What was that transformation like for you?
I think it was a longing for connection. So I was working in the city and I just felt profoundly unhappy and disconnected, and understanding a lot more now about ideas around belonging and the self and wholeness. I can see now that unhappiness and that frustration stemmed from feeling out of alignment. And I think that's really common for loads of people. That's why people love stories of people career changing or following their dreams, or, you know, giving up their work and doing something more meaningful, because I think so many people feel this same frustration and disconnection. And it was just this deep sense of wanting to do something meaningful, or that felt meaningful to me, and searching for this connection. And I say nature in inverted commas. I guess that was the thing that felt important to me and still does. And it's something that I wanted to pursue. And I just thought, if I don't do it, I think I'm always going to be miserable and I'll just regret it. Yeah.
Was there a particular experience or species that first sparked that passion for gardening for you?
Rather than sparked it, I think it was probably a reigniting, because when I was little, I was extremely outdoorsy and curious. My brother and I would ride our bikes around our little village and go to the park, and I have memories of scattering, I think they were lettuce seeds from the front of a magazine under our living room window, and being amazed that they sprouted, and then collecting all the slugs and putting them in margarine tubs and stuff. I absolutely loved all of that stuff. I really distinctly remember as well buddleia covered in butterflies. I think it was growing from our neighbour's garden, but I then just completely lost interest, lost connection with all of that. And I think the thing that really reignited that interest was in that period where I was pretty miserable, thinking, what am I doing? And I was sitting in our flat in East London, and at the end of this gravelly, stony bit outside our flat, there was this weed growing, in inverted commas again. I didn't know what it was at the time. And then this bird flew down and sat on it, and it had like gold flashes on it and it had red on it. And I just remember thinking, that is so beautiful. And I cannot believe I do not know what that plant is, and I do not know what that bird is. As it turns out, the plant was a sow thistle, it was a sonchus, and the bird was a goldfinch. And at that time, I just had no idea. And I just thought that was the saddest thing and a complete travesty. And that what could be more important than knowing those things, like knowing that, felt more important than anything I knew at the time. And so that really set me off on I need more of that in my life, and I need more of that knowing and that knowledge. So I guess in a way it was very considered, like what things could I do that would put me in more contact with that? And somehow I landed on gardening. I think part of the reason was because I knew I didn't want to do something like ecology. I was worried that it would be a lot of report writing and counting and surveying, and I didn't want that for me. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I just knew it didn't feel right for me. I wanted to feel active and expansive and out there in nature. And so although gardening doesn't have much glamour or all the trappings that people think of as a successful thing to do, it's what drew me.
It's beautiful to hear that memory for you, and there's this overwhelming sense of wonder and mystery that comes up for me when you talk about that memory. And I think one of the things that I loved and appreciated so much with Radicle and the pieces that I've read was this sense of, as you said at the beginning, like not claiming to have all the answers and just being curious enough to ask the question, because so much richness comes from even just asking the question, right? Mm-hmm. And the answer will be different for every person and for every context and the ecology that they might find themselves in. So that's something that really resonated for me.
Thank you. Yes. And also things change too. So our situations change, the environment changes. And so therefore the answer might change as well. And different questions might be relevant. So I think there's a lot of power to be had in asking questions as opposed to constantly providing answers, which is so much what we're often prompted to do, as if that's the right thing to do.
I can imagine that the journey that gardening and wanting to make room for marginalised voices within that led you down is, to a certain extent, connected to identity. And I wonder, when people ask you the question, where are you from, what truths are missing from the answer that you give?
That question, I think my feelings towards it really vary depending on who's asking it and why. And I think that often when people ask that question, it's not always from a place of genuine care or curiosity. It feels, particularly if it's from someone who you don't really know and maybe you've only just met, and then they come at you with this question, it can feel quite intrusive and like an entitlement to that kind of information about you. And so if I provide the answer of, oh, I come from Lincolnshire, or I was born in England, then it's often very rapidly followed up with something along the lines of, yeah, but where are you really from? And I think quite often that speaks to the fact that question is actually coded, and it's saying, oh, you're not white British, so how have you ended up being here? Or not white British, you don't really look like you belong here. And so that's the undercurrent. And whether people realise that that's how it feels or not, I don't know. So there's so much that's missing from it. And then when people then say, oh, where are you really from? I'll say, oh, my parents are like Hong Kong Chinese and Malaysian Chinese. But yeah, there's always so much missing. And one of the things that I increasingly feel is missing for me is that beyond that they are Chinese from Hong Kong and Malaysia, I don't really know past that, really. And I guess part of that is because I just haven't been curious about it enough when in my earlier years. And I guess I'm more curious now, but I haven't done any probing into it. So beyond that, I don't really know either. Like, where do any of us come from?
Such a powerful question. And it seems like More Than Human World is such a rich space of inquiry to analyse and critique that question. I am so happy to be reading Jessica J. Lee's new book, Dispersals, on plants, borders and belonging. And one of the things I love so much about analysing belonging through the lens of plant species or other non-human species is they really challenge your perceptions of those concepts, right? Especially from a Western capitalist lens. And as part of Roots of Belonging, we've been thinking a lot about this question of what tree makes you feel like you belong. And it's so interesting because for me, the tree that makes me feel like I belong is the cherry blossom tree, because that was the tree of my childhood. And I felt a really strong kinship with that tree. It made me feel safe. And I just had a lot of positive memories associated. And it's followed me throughout my life. Like at university, I was, in Washington, D.C., there's a huge number of cherry blossom trees there. And in London, you see them in a lot of places. But what's been interesting about that is reading Dispersals. Jessica has an essay about the cherry blossom tree, and she talks about how the cherry blossom tree was used as a colonial tool, essentially, by the Japanese in Taiwan and Korea and other parts of Southeast Asia. And it's so interesting to me that something that has been such a symbol of home and belonging for me personally in my life can have a very different significance for someone who's Korean or someone who's Taiwanese. And even for Jessica, who is part Taiwanese, holds both of those feelings at the same time, can understand that the cherry blossom tree was used for colonial power, but also makes her feel at home because they're everywhere in Berlin where she now lives. I wonder, what's a tree that makes you feel like you belong?
Oh, gosh. I mean, first of all, that's so beautiful that, it is possible to hold those two different truths, that something can be so meaningful and bring that feeling of home and levity, and that there are serious and, for some people, negative connotations with it. It's okay for both of those things to be true at once. Gosh, what tree do I feel at home with? At the moment, I would say oak. We are so lucky. We have a really beautiful garden and we have several oaks in it, and there's just something so majestic about them, and they're so long-lived. They're such a kind of beautiful home to so many beings. Like in this country, I think it's actually the tree that is a habitat for the most number of species. So there's something really beautiful about that. I think I'll say oak for now.
And what does home taste, sound, smell and feel like for you?
Oh, home is such a visceral feeling, isn't it? I think you really know when you feel it. And I think it's somewhere that feels warm and welcoming, where you have this sense that you're going to be cared for and loved. And to me, it tastes like steamed rice and my mum's herbal soup. And I mean, this is going to be very foodie themed, I think, because it also tastes like stir-fried ginger and garlic. Absolutely. I mean, as soon as that smell hits your nose and your taste buds, there's just something so comforting about it. And it sounds like bird song for me, probably the robin, the blackbird, the great tit, the jay, the buzzards. We have quite a few buzzards where we are. And it sounds like laughter and chatter and someone cooking in the kitchen. And also it sounds like silence. I mean, sometimes it's never really silent because there's always like noises in the background or animal sounds, bird songs, but that companionable silence that you can share with somebody, like to me, that's how you know you're home, when you are with someone who you just feel completely at ease with in silence.
And what does it look like?
I think it looks quite busy, as in like it looks, there are meaningful objects around. I'm not into these minimalist bare spaces. I always find them a bit eerie, and where are the people, where are the things that make meaning here? So I like having objects around. I like loads of books around. I feel so comforted by books. Ridiculously huge TBR piles.
How many piles do you have at the moment?
Oh my gosh, you don't want to know. So many. It's, obscene. But books and having bits and bobs around and things that remind you of holidays and people and artwork.
I can hard relate with the piles of books. And it's funny because I've saved so many of the books that you've put on Decolonize the Garden. It's ridiculous. Like, honestly, I need to start my own library.
Yeah, same. Maybe we can join forces.
Yes, collective library. How has the concept and the felt experience of the garden, in inverted commas, changed for you as you've developed and given energy and love to these two projects?
I think initially I viewed the garden as like an escape and a sanctuary, like somewhere where you could be shut off from the world, no one around, just you and the plants gardening in this little bubble. And it's definitely moved away from that because I think it's just impossible to separate gardening from the outside world, and it's impossible to separate all the meaning and politics that can be found in gardening and brought to the fore. And so it's like this place now where the way things work in the world and the systems that we live under and sometimes reinforce and perpetuate are just made so obvious to me. It can still be a place of sanctuary. I can still lose myself and forget things in there, but it's also like a place to remember what it is we want to do and what we value, how we want to live in relation to all the beings that we share the garden with and all the other beings on the earth. So it's definitely become a much more, I guess, radical place to what it was when I first started gardening, and holds much more meaning and a place to remember what it's all about, remember ourselves and remember our relationships. And it's like a place of community and for making connection with all of those things. So yeah, I think it's changed quite dramatically to when I first started.
Wow, that's wonderful that even in that drastic change, it's still something that you feel so strongly connected to and a practice that has been with you throughout the years, essentially. And what gives you hope as well as you continue to do that work of dismantling dominant systems?
I actually think doing the work gives me hope, like being active and doing something that feels, first of all, proactive and something that you feel like you're building and doing in community. That gives me hope. Like, I don't think hope is something that you just like sit there and wish for. And because that's almost like saying, oh, someone else will do it, or I hope someone else comes along and does something. Like seeing all the things that so many other people are doing like you. And, you know, there are so many projects going on, so many people like wanting the same thing, really.
On a more personal note, what things have been composting and growing for you in your life?
Gosh, I mean, so much. I think one of the things that's been composting a lot recently is how I'm interested in building relationships, like how we relate and how we build community. I mean, so many of these issues are related, but so often we can have like the best of intentions, but we end up falling into the same patterns and things break down over the same things happening. And I guess, I mean, we've chatted briefly away from this about gatherings and circles, but as a result of looking at my own relationship with myself and how I relate with others, I've moved towards circle work. And it's just one of many ways and things that we can do. But for me, it's a way of having structured gatherings with people that enable us to practice different ways of being with each other. I guess that's a big composting for me, is like practicing ways of being and relating, whether that's with ourselves or with other people or with other living beings.
That's so beautiful, and it feels like the great question of our time, doesn't it? I'm also really interested in thinking about relational ways of being in terms of non-human species. One of the most urgent things for me that has been in the back of my mind for a while now is relating to, in particular, non-human animals that are perceived as being non-charismatic, and have been really inspired by Michael Mallay's work, Late Light, on that subject. So this past weekend I was in Snowdonia, had the privilege of being surrounded by a ton of like other people who are looking to diversify the UK outdoors and make it more inclusive. People who are making real change in the communities in which they do the grassroots work. But I had this moment where I was listening to someone speaking about their origin story and like where they're at, and this fly like sits on my hand. I don't quite know what kind of fly he was, but he wasn't a mosquito and he wasn't a blue bottle, but he had really long legs that were hairy. And, you know, if I was myself like 2 years ago, I would have been like, oh, like, get him off me, get him off, like, and like flick my hand away. And that urge is still there, you know, the small urge to do that is still there. But actually, I just let him hang out on my hand. And I thought, oh, is he going to bite me and take my blood or whatever? And actually, he just like wanted a rest. He just sat on my hand and I was like, oh, he actually feels like good there. He's got some like hairy legs that feel quite nice. But that inquiry of like, why do I have a visceral reaction to that being? Why do I have a negative reaction to that being? And being able to sit in the discomfort of that. And I'm sure like, because you've done circle work, and I think that there's a lot of that kind of questioning in that type of work too, is the liminal space. Someone might have difficulty that they might want to raise, and the space is there to hold someone between point A to point B, and to be okay with that transformation and to not shy away from it. I don't know where I'm going with this, but
I love it. It's brilliant. I absolutely love that story because I love the honesty in it. And, you know, I completely agree. Like I have those, I don't know if it's instinct, maybe it's more of a learnt thing, but that feeling too. And it's like a constant practice, as so many things are. It is a practicing of like, how do I want to be in relationship with this being, and to question our learnt reactions. And those learnt reactions can be so deep and embedded that they can feel natural. I don't know if they are or not. Maybe there's an element of them that is, like for our safety. But yeah, it's like giving ourselves that space and that opportunity to practice. And we need constant reminders of that. So like we have to, often make an effort, like conscious effort to be like, let's not immediately flick this thing off, which can be really hard. And that's the gathering and the circle work. That's what enables. It's like having boundaries and a container in place where we can safely practice that and we're all on the same page.
And what might a garden of your belonging look like and why?
Oh my gosh, a garden of my belonging. That's such an interesting question. The thing that immediately springs to mind is that there's a lot of fruit and vegetables in it and a lot of people. Like these things take a lot of work. They don't just happen. And it's a lot of hard work.
Yes, it takes a lot.
Yeah. But I think these things are often so much more beautiful done together, like, and in community with family. I was really lucky. I grew up really close to extended family and multiple generations, like living in a proximity to each other. So I had like my uncles and my aunts and my grandparents and my great grandma even around. My parents, of course, my sibling and my cousins. But doing things together closely like that can be so joyous. And so in my garden of belonging, there are lots of people doing things in harmony and in community, full of wildlife and full of people not being scared of the bugs, people not being scared of the dirt, everyone mucking in, loads of flowers, loads of fruit, loads of vegetables. I'm intrigued to know what yours looks like.
Oh, this is this is like the third time that I've been caught out with my own question. It would just be this kind of confusing mix of things. Like 100% there'd be a jade vine. 100% is my favorite flower. And for those who don't know, the jade
this is going to be quite a warm garden then.
Yes,
I should have specified the same. Warm, please.
It's going to be like tropical. Passion flowers will be there. And yeah, for people who don't know, the jade vine is native to the Philippines and the rainforest. It's becoming increasingly rare because it's not pollinated by insects, but it's pollinated by bats. So the colour glows in the moonlight and the bats are drawn to it and they drink from it. And then the flower like taps them on the back of the head and it puts pollen on the back of the neck of the bat, which just that whatever that situation is, I love it. However that came about, I just love everything about that. And yeah, it would just be... There'd be lots of little spaces for people to have some solitude time, but not be far away from things happening or people happening. And the soil would have like lots going on. There would just be like tons of like living beings, tons of worms and just really alive
just
soil.
loads of life.
But something around like the forest form of, I don't know the correct phrase, but like the forest form of like growing fruit and vegetables, where there's like a lot of layers to like the rich abundance of it.
Yeah, a bit like a forest garden perhaps, or like a polyculture where everything's growing together.
Yeah, like everything growing together. Like you can like look one direction and there would be like just every kind of fruit you want in the world, like dragon fruit and all the fruits.
Yeah, mangoes.
Just basically everything in one place. There's no end to it. Just all the best of everything together. And bamboo forest with light like pouring through the top. And I want really cool birds that make intricate nests, like the ones that hang upside down, or the nests that look like they could be an architectural digest, you know.
Yeah, like how did they do that?
Yeah, interesting ways of building homes. I want more of that. And I want the beavers there. I want the beavers.
This garden is big.
It's a big place.
Oh, you talking has also made me think I'd really like a hammock or a daybed, somewhere to loll.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be lolling.
yes. Oh, I love that so much. And well, it's funny because my other question for you was, how might that garden look differently if it was to represent collective belonging? But collective belonging was already incorporated into your answer.
Yeah, I think in an idealized world, that is what it would look like. And it makes me feel sad that it has to be in an idealized world, that feels like it would come to fruition. I feel like we're so separated and isolated, and everyone's got their individual homes and areas and gardens.
And earlier you talked about willingness or desire to push out the edges and push out the boundaries. I mean, how does that show up for you in gardening work itself?
I think it goes back a lot to questioning everything. Is this perceived wisdom necessarily the best or right way to be doing something? Kind of changing how I view things. So the way I view plants is very different to the way I might have been taught. So I studied horticulture at college, and a lot of it can be quite combative and controlling, and everything's very hierarchical. I guess a lot of gardening is about order and control. So it's like pushing where can some of that be relinquished, and what does sharing the space look like? What does co-creating the space look like? That it's not just about what I want as the gardener or my needs. And I particularly felt that coming to the garden that I garden now, because it's quite a mature garden. There's a real mix of stuff there. It's so rich with wildlife and completely abundant with what we would call weeds. Some of them pretty pernicious weeds, like very tenacious. And so I really had to change my view on that, because I wanted the garden to be a place of pleasure, and I didn't want it to be this place of combat or this feeling of stress. That's the last thing I wanted to feel in my garden. I've really had to change my view on how I see a lot of the plants, and that garden isn't just for me.
And who else is it for?
Gosh, I mean, like we have grass snakes, we have slow worms, there are shrews and mice, and some of the plants that came with the garden include bracken, bramble, ground elder. So many of these, if you looked them up, would be scary, making you sigh plants. But actually, if you give them space, and obviously you pull it out here and there and you edit and you make space for yourself too, but I think it is possible to live alongside them and not feel that fighty, dominating feeling inside.
Yeah, I think it seems like over the last few years there, of which your voice has been a really strong part of that conversation, of challenging aesthetic preferences and where those aesthetic preferences originate from, where that comes from, particularly the history of how horticulture and gardening more generally is intertwined with colonialism, and there's been so much vital inquiry into that. It's fascinating to me how, from my parents' generation, love order, and they love the European, garden, the chinoiserie style, like let's just grab everything from every other place and put box hedge around it and make the lavender go in these long lines like in Provence and all this stuff. And I just feel complete opposite. Like I've gone in the complete, I've literally just told you what my garden of belonging looks like. It looks like jade vine next to a beaver, which literally makes no sense. So yeah, I find it so fascinating how within one generation that aesthetic preference can have shifted so much. What are you personally interrogating in terms of your own aesthetic wishes? You've already touched on that already. But what's a specific example maybe of a particular species that you're looking at differently?
Ground elder was a big one when I arrived in the garden because it's a plant that creeps with underground roots. It can really spread rapidly. If you chop it and leave a bit of root, it will grow again. But this is a plant that it can be edible. It's not like the loveliest, tastiest thing, but it can be edible. It actually has really beautiful flowers as well. It's related to the carrot family and looks quite cow parsley-like. But yeah, so I feel like I've had to befriend it. But in terms of aesthetics, we've been programmed to love the things that are really showy and blousy. And I guess it's like just getting to know better the plants that are there, or the plants that we like to call weeds, like quite an othering, alienating term. But I think the more you get to know something and care about it and develop a relationship with it, the more love you have for it and the greater the understanding. And I feel like so many of the plants that we call weeds are incredibly beautiful. It's just that we often overlook them and don't stop to appreciate them. I also have an area in our garden that I leave to grow to meadow. And it's so beautiful to watch, like the shifting of the mix of plants there, how the plant community is evolving. It's just so fascinating. That idea of tidiness, like so much of inherited gardening belief is that it should look tidy, because we find it so hard, I think, to see the abundance in messiness or the joy in messiness. That's definitely something I had really ingrained in me. And I think partly as well from this, it's something to do with achieving and trauma, that idea of things having to be neat and tidy. I think it's related. So having to overcome that has been a really big thing. And it's definitely been a process and a practice of reconditioning my mind as to what it is I'm seeing, understanding better what it is I'm seeing. But I also acknowledge that there can be something very calming and pleasing about order. It doesn't have to be all one or the other. This whole move towards rewilding or leaving things as they are, I think it can also go too far the other way. We can forget that people matter too, and that people are part of the ecosystem too. People also have needs, and it's also okay for people to have different aesthetic preferences, and for there to be places where there's order and places where we let things go more. All of those things are okay. It's not all binary, and it's not like straightforward, easy answers.
What you said is so poignant. I resonate with a lot of that, and perhaps this sense of balance and being curious about why there might be a preference. From what you've said, what stuck out to me as well is the plant that I've recently learned about and now really love is the watermint, because it grows at the ecotone, so between the land and water, and it is a symbol or signifies a really rich ecosystem. And it smells just like mint. You can eat and drink it just like any mint that we normally have, but it has these beautiful small flowers that come out between June and July. And it's so interesting what you said about the blousy, showy plants that get a lot of airtime. It's well, actually, there's something so meaningful and beautiful to be said for the smaller plants that maybe only come out at one particular time of the year, and you have to be patient enough to witness it in that time of its life.
Yeah.
But the fact that it signifies a healthy ecosystem and a healthy way of relating just between different species, both plant and human and animal as well, because And where I saw them was in a beaver home, so where the beavers had chewed down all the trees and it had flooded. And because of the activity of the beavers in building their home, it led to the ability for the water mint to actually grow and thrive. And now the water mint feeds like other species and insects and all these things. And something about that feels a lot more healing than, maybe a Dutch tulip or something like that.
Yeah. It's so rich with meaning and story and connection.
And finally, what advice would you give to someone who finds themselves unsure of where or how they belong?
Oh, that's such a huge question. For a start, I can't really speak for other people and their personal experiences and situations, so I can only really speak for myself. And for me, I have always had a really deep, innate sense of belonging. I've always felt that I belong, and I do put a lot of that down to feeling a very visceral connection with the world around me, the living world around me, which is one of the things that prompted me to even want to go into gardening and horticulture. I went to a talk that Robin Wall-Kimmerer was giving last week in London. She wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, and she was asked a question about wholeness. I think it was related to her studying botany and being told what did and didn't belong in the science of botany. And she said about how she's always felt a wholeness, but there were times where she was very quiet. And that resonated with me so much, because I really feel strongly that that's how I feel too, that I've always felt this. And to me, wholeness and belonging are very intertwined. I've always felt this sense of belonging. And when I think about it, the times where I might not have felt a belonging or an unbelonging is because of things that people might have done or said that then makes you question your belonging, makes you feel like either in some way wrong or shameful or unaccepted. I thought about this question a lot over the last 3 or 4 years. Conversations around race really make you think about belonging and what it means. For me, such a large part of it is about relationships, how you relate to yourself and to other people and to the rest of the living world around you. The start of that healthy relationship is your relationship with yourself. That sense of safety within yourself, to build it up, to me is so key. Because it's like having that allows you to really listen to yourself, your instinct and your gut, your intuition, and for you to tune into what your needs are, what your values are. And then you can only really have that healthy and full sense of belonging with other people and the world from that as a basis. And I don't say that to diminish the fact as well that there are a lot of structural and systemic issues that keep people from that, from being able to have that. People are exhausted and kept in poverty. There are so many things that stop people from being able to develop these perhaps healthy relationships. I was reading in Riverford's newsletter the other day, Ruth Allen. She's a geologist and a psychotherapist, but she wrote in that newsletter about how noticing beauty increases positive emotions. And she said about how awe actually lowers inflammation. And I've always been somehow fortunate enough to have always had that appreciation and that noticing. And I think that ability to tap into that helps me to be connected to myself and to stay healthy. And so I know what feels good to me, what's in alignment, what I need. And then in those ways you feel happier and you develop better relationships and you just have this sense of belonging. And I also love the idea as well that when you feel like you belong, like what do you belong to? It's like the biggest thing you can belong to is the earth, and we all belong here. Like none of us are inherently wrong or bad or shameful. And I think if you have this strong sense of self and that idea of safety comes from you first, that's like such a big part of the story. But for me, that journey, like your internal journey to reach that place, is such a key building block.
I couldn't agree more. And funnily enough, it aligns with our framework of belonging.
Brilliant.
Finally, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where might they find you?
On the Decolonize the Garden Instagram account, and then the Radicle newsletter, and that's a Substack newsletter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue.
Thank you, Izzy. Thanks.
Hi friends, thank you so much for listening to Xeno, a podcast which is all about home, identity and the search for belonging. I'm so grateful to be sharing these conversations with you to help build a more nuanced picture of what belonging means in our world today. Our theme music is by Alix Julian Edwards and our branding is designed by Somewhere Off Grid. If you want to find out more about our upcoming episodes or receive more resources on crafting your sense of home and belonging, you can subscribe to our newsletter at xenocast.org or follow us on Instagram at xeno_pod. I'd really appreciate it if you could share our work with other people, share it with friends who you think might resonate with our message, and rate and comment on our podcast on either Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for your generous attention and for listening to our stories.